I see Israel as a doppelganger of European colonialism, much more directly. I think that the idea, the narrative of Zionism is that Jews would become safe if they had a European-like state of their own. So they replicated forms of nationalism that have oppressed Jews for centuries in Europe. There have been genocides and holocausts throughout the history of colonialism and capitalism. And there were anti-colonial thinkers like Nehru in India, Aimé Césaire in Martinique, W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States, who, as fascism was rising in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, were saying, well, this is actually a boomerang, in Césaire's words. This is colonialism coming back to Europe. That all of these techniques, the theories of race, like the bogus race science, the technologies of the concentration camps, the laws against racial mixing, all of these predated the European fascists, and in fact were developed in Namibia against the Nama and Herero, were used in South Africa, were used against indigenous people in the Americas, were used in the transatlantic slave trade. And so what Césaire was saying, what Du Bois was saying, what Nehru was saying was that Hitler was the doppelganger of European colonization and imperialism coming home. In Césaire's words, it's the boomerang. It's now coming back and being directed towards Europeans. The reason why it matters whether or not the Nazis were an aberration in an otherwise sort of salutary story of the advance of the modern world, or whether it is a thread, any particularly extreme chapter of a long and winding story that is in fact hundreds of years old. The reason why it matters is because we have to diagnose this correctly if we're not going to replicate it again. So it matters that Hitler was inspired by the Western frontier in the United States. It mattered that he drew direct analogies from the westward expansion in the Americas and said, this is our eastward expansion, our Lebensraum. We also need elbow room, breathing room, just as the Americas needed it, and that is why they had their genocide and expanded westward. So we can too, right? Because those parallels were almost sort of unspeakable, particularly because it was the Americans and the British and the Allies who defeated Hitler and wanted a triumphant story where they could just say, that was them, not us, it had nothing to do with us. The reason why it matters that we diagnose this correctly, that we see this correctly, that we, the way I think of it is put the Holocaust back in history, so that we're not lifting it out of history and saying it's something primordial that is only about Jew hatred, is because if we don't understand it, then we will replicate it. And in fact, I believe that that's what happened by seeing Israel as an acceptable form of reparations for the Holocaust, specifically Israel as an ethno-state, that is identified as a Jewish state, which therefore needs to maintain Jewish supremacy with a demographic majority. How do you do that in a majority Palestinian territory? Well, you can only do it through ethnic cleansing, which is what happened in 1948 with the Nakba. But it becomes continuous because there's always the demographic threat. Gaza represents the most concentrated population of Palestinians, and so there's always been a segment of Israeli political society that believed that they had to get rid of that demographic threat. And so I don't think that it's an acceptable reparations for one Holocaust to say now we are passing the mantle of whiteness onto you as a form of reparations, to say now you get to be the colonists and you get to do ethnic cleansing. I think the only light for me has been the fact that there have been new and old movements coming together with tremendous stamina day after day, understanding that as horrific as the attacks were on October 7th, there is no justification for collective punishment, for bombing children, hospitals, schools, universities, this frenzy of revenge, and really, I believe taking advantage of the horror of those attacks, the shock of those attacks, in order to fulfill a pre-existing agenda, which is something I've seen again and again, which is to reduce the number of Palestinians and to expand Israeli control over Gaza. What we're seeing in Gaza and why so much of the global South stands so powerfully with Palestinians, and also why so many people who are discriminated against in the global North stand with them, is because they see it as a glimpse of a genocidal future. I think what Gaza shows is that you actually can't have it both ways. If you believe in universal values, you have to apply them across the board. There can't be any exceptions, because in a sense, the exception will become the rule. And we're seeing a resurgence of ethno-nationalism all around the world. Israel is a very exaggerated case with its far-right government and the openness of ethno-nationalism there, but it is not alone. I think it needs to be understood in the context of all these other far-right forces around the world that are rising. And so the hope for me is that there's also a reassertion of the need for universalist values, the need to stand in solidarity with one another and build, what in North America we call multiracial alliances, multiracial and multi-ethnic movements that understand that all of our liberation and all of our safety are entangled with one another. So it isn't going to be just Jews or just Palestinians or even Jews and Palestinians who are together going to fight for this. It's got to be the broadest possible coalition.
As many as 300 protesters were arrested in Brooklyn on Tuesday night, where thousands of mostly Jewish New Yorkers gathered for a Seder in the streets to stop arming Israel, they said. This on the second night of Passover. The demonstration was held at Grand Army Plaza, 1 block away from the home of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. It came just hours before the Senate overwhelmingly approved a $95 billion foreign aid package that includes some $14 billion in arms and security funding to Israel. A series of speakers addressed the rally.
What I want to say to you this evening at this revolutionary and historic Seder in the streets is that too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again. They are enraptured by it. They are drunk on it. They are profaned by it. And that false idol is called Zionism. It is a false idol that takes our most profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery, the story of Passover itself, and turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft. Roadmaps for ethnic cleansing and genocide. I get a lot of hope from Jewish Voice for Peace. They are. I've been on their board for 15 years, and when I started working with Jewish Voice for Peace, they were tiny. They were so small and so marginal. They had 2 staff people. Now they have, I think, 40 some people who work full time. They have hundreds of chapters. They're able to get hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And the polling shows that they represent a huge generational divide within the Jewish community, where young people don't believe that they're young people increasingly are alienated from the idea of Jewish safety being tied to an ethno-nationalist project. They believe Jewish safety is part of a project of a broader anti-racist project. That means standing in solidarity with Muslims when they are under attack from far-right figures like Trump and Wilders, and also when Palestinians are under attack in Gaza. So I think there is a shift. It's just, I feel like we've seen in these months the worst and the best of what people are capable of. Part of what we're seeing in, what is sometimes described as the pro-Palestine movement, I think it's a misunderstanding. I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a very broad-based movement that understands that violence and genocide has been part of capitalist history from the start, and that our future rests in really challenging the logics that were built in from the beginning, that always unsaw large groups of people in large parts of the planet and sort of said they didn't count, and that's why we can create our doppelganger settler colonial states on top of their lands because they're not real people, and their cultures don't count, and we can wipe them out. And this has been the brutal history of capitalism. So the young people who I teach at university know that this system is failing, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's the normalization of the shredding of international law. And so they're interested in system change. They're interested in a much, not just in like stop the war or acting on climate. They want a different system that will actually get at the roots of this. Which are that dominance-based logic, which are just the unseeing of people and whole geographies as sacrifice zones. They want a future where actually everyone is equal. It's so radical. It is radical. It actually is radical to imagine a future where everyone is equal. It's not a namby-pamby liberal value. It's a radical transformative value. And I think people are fighting for it in the streets, and they're being lied about and accused of being, pro-terrorist or whatever the latest lies are. But when I talk to my students, they're fighting for life, and they can't believe that their leaders, their so-called leaders, want them to accept a world where children, get dismembered and hospitals get bombed and aid workers get targeted, and we're supposed to all act like that's normal. They won't do it, and I see my job as being like, you're not crazy. You're paying attention, and you still have a beating heart, and keep at it.